Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub. Welcome to part 2 of my conversation with a fascinating, brilliant individual, Aryeh Green, who's written a wonderful book about a journey he took. It was 8 weeks long, 600 miles on Israel's national trail, Hebrew,
Shvil Yisrael.
Shvil Yisrael. He's written all about it in a book, My Israel Trail, Finding Peace in the Promised Land. He has an incredible background, an incredible resume that gives him insights into so much of what Jewish life is today. He made Aliyah about 30 years ago. At the time, he was going to become a Reform rabbi, but he ended up in high-tech industry. He helped develop energy resources in Africa. He worked for many years, 10 years, with Natan Sharansky. He was also involved in Israeli Hasbara as the director of Media Central in Jerusalem, which was focusing on honest reporting for foreign correspondents in Israel. He brings a breadth of understanding that is not only illuminating for us, but we rarely get to see and talk to somebody with the experiences that Aryeh Green has. And in addition, I have fallen in love with him. He's one of the most loveliest individuals you could ever meet. Thank you so much for staying with me and talking again. We're going to talk about My Israel Trail, I promise, on this edition of L'Chaim. But I want to finish some of the discussion we had on part 1, and I'm going to feed you the question you were beginning to answer, which was the following. We discussed how you are a liberal Jew in so many ways. You grew up a typical liberal Jew in America. You come to Israel, you still have a liberal perspective on many of the social and political issues confronting Israel, and yet you use language that is normally not associated with the left in Israel. You talk about the West Bank as disputed territory. You agree that the West Bank is not Palestinian territory. And you don't want to use the word occupation. You feel that that leads American Jews down the wrong path. You are critical in many ways of American liberal leadership, which focuses so much on the criticisms of Israel while failing to put it into a context of all of the fabulous, marvelous things that Israel is. So I asked you, how can you be both when many times we categorize people? If you're liberal, you see things one way. If you're on the right, you see things another way. And you were beginning to describe that. We just ran out of time. So people weren't there for part 1. They were there for part 1. They heard some of your answer. I'm asking you to begin at the beginning. Explain how you as a liberal Jew also see yourself in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Israeli society as a whole today.
I'm happy to share with you what I guess is a somewhat unique perspective, having grown up in America, having a family that's been in America for so many years, non-observant, becoming more observant, living in Israel, but retaining both that identity as a liberal American Jew, even while I became more observant, and also living in Israel and understanding after 35 years what it means to be Israeli.
By the way, you and I would not want to give the impression that there's a dichotomy between being observant and being liberal.
Absolutely not.
One can be a wholly liberal Jew and also a very wholly observant Jew, yes?
Which, absolutely. Just as one can be a conservative Jew and completely unobservant Jewishly.
That is correct. Right.
Now, I started in the previous segment, I started to use Yossi Klein Halevi's book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, as an example of a fervently liberal Jew, Israeli, who wrote very articulately about his own support for a Palestinian state in its eventual establishment, and yet at the same time, using the vocabulary that we're discussing, supports the reaffirmation of the legitimacy of Israel and the return of the Jewish people to our ancestral homeland. And I was using that as one example that's very contemporary, because you've had him here and interviewed Yossi. I was actually, as a caveat, or just as a qualifier, as it were, describing my own support for the idea of yet another 22nd state for the Arab nation in our region to be called Palestine or what have you. And my two caveats were that, number one, it has to be democratic. My hope is that all Arab and Muslim nations will become, as societies, more open, tolerant, and democratic, because as Natan Sharansky has said, as I said earlier, democracies don't make war with other democracies. And so that was a condition from my standpoint of what would bring real peace. Not a condition for negotiations, but a necessary condition for eventual peace between Israel and its neighbors. The other caveat or condition or qualifier I was going to share with you is the question of its location. Should Palestine be established as an independent state? Which is a whole other discussion which we won't have, whether or not the Palestinians as an ethnic grouping, self-identifying as such, deserve an independent state more than the Kurds or the Tibetans or the Basques or the Catalans or the Quebecois even in Canada. That's a whole different discussion. If a Palestinian state is going to be established, the question of where it should be established, should it be established in that 70% of mandatory Palestine on the eastern side of the River Jordan, is a possibility that should be at least explored, given that 70% of the people living in present-day Jordan identify themselves as Palestinian. Whether it should be established in what's known as the West Bank of the Jordan River, or the historical heartland of the Jewish people, Judea and Samaria, what, yes, I call the disputed territories. This is an open question. In real peace between the Arab world and Israel, between the Palestinian society and the Israelis, the question of where their independence takes form should be something that's eminently resolvable. Just as an example, we could have a confederation of states between present-day Jordan, a Palestine to be established in Judea and Samaria, the disputed territories, and Israel, who jointly administer those territories so that we can recognize that there's a shared history, a shared connection to those hills north and south of Jerusalem in a situation of real peace, peaceful relations between the two societies. Anything is conceivable. I've explored these ideas with some of my Palestinian Arab Muslim friends who are true moderates, who really are interested in peace with Israel. And the reason they're open to these ideas is because they don't reject the connection of the Jews to this land, neither Judea and Samaria, nor the rest of present-day Israel, certainly not to the Temple Mount where the Jewish temple stood. All of these ideas are not right-wing ideas. And that's why I want to bring you the other example that I mentioned before. When I was running Media Central, this is this project of honest reporting that you mentioned, that basically provides services still today to the foreign press who are based in or visiting Israel. We had a number of different events related to the whole issue of the Temple Mount back in the days when, and unfortunately this comes around every few years, where the Arabs use as a pretext for further violence the idea that Jews are trying somehow to take over the Temple Mount. I brought Moshe Raz to speak with the foreign press. Now, Moshe Raz is a name you may be familiar with. Your viewers may or may not be. He's one of the founders of Peace Now, one of the founders of the radically left Meretz party in Israel. Never to be confused with anybody on the right or even on the center of Israeli politics. Moshe Raz stood in front of a packed room of the foreign press, including at that point the bureau chief of the New York Times. And he said the following, and I just am pointing out that the bureau chief of the New York Times, by his body language, showed how incredibly different and impressive this was. He put down his pen and sat up and looked quizzically at Moshe Raz. Why? What did Moshe Raz say? Moshe Raz said, never confuse my advocacy of a withdrawal by Israel, and he advocated unilateral and immediate withdrawal with no conditions. He said, never confuse my advocacy of a withdrawal by Israel from the territories with agreement with those who say that Israel has no claim or right to be there. You, the foreign media, and the leadership of the world need to understand that even if I believe as a left-wing kind of proponent of withdrawal in a Palestinian state, that that's what we should do to bring peace to our region, it doesn't mean that I agree with those who say that we have no claim to it. His point was very simple, and he said this. It is a massive concession on the part of Israel, on the part of the Jewish people, to relinquish our claim to our ancestral homeland of Hebron, where our patriarchs are buried, Shechem, Nablus, which is a historically central part of the Jewish people's connection to this land, eastern sections of Jerusalem, let alone the Temple Mount, where our temple stood as a symbol of national sovereignty, not only just of religious worship. The idea that an Israeli government and the Jewish people are going to agree to withdraw from these areas which we actually came into as the result of a defensive military operation under international law, let alone having a prior claim to those areas from the mandate given to Great Britain to foment the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people based on our history and historical connection with this land. You have to recognize, and the leaders of the world need to recognize, what a massive concession that is. This is not Israel withdrawing from territories that it illegally occupied as a result of a belligerent act of conquest. This is a statement by the Jewish leadership of the nation state of the Jewish people that we favor peace. We favor an accommodation with our neighbors and an acknowledgement of others' claims to these territories over our own claims. And if we are to relinquish that claim in favor of peace, we need that to be understood, however we might be compensated for relinquishing those claims. My point is, whether it's Yossi Klein Halevi, Moshe Raz, or others, the idea of being a progressive, liberal proponent of a Palestinian state does not mean that we have to adopt the incredibly antagonistic, hostile, and ahistorical terminology that Palestinian leaders and their supporters in the political world, in the cultural world, and elsewhere use to delegitimize and defame and demonize Israel and our leadership and our claim and connection to these territories.
You talk about a Palestinian state being democratic and deciding where it will reside. What Muslim country, what Arab country at the moment do you feel is a legitimate democracy?
Oh, there's no
None.
full democracy in
None.
the Arab world. No.
And yet you're saying you will make peace with the Palestinians if
When?
if and when they are democratic. And I'm saying to myself, that's just, yeah.
So I have,
of all the things you've said to me, there's something that doesn't feel honest there. What you're really saying is never.
well, that's
Because unless you tell me there's something around the corner that you've met or talked to where you believe there's a leadership in the Palestinian world that's going to change the entire dynamic and create the first democracy in the Arab world, short of that, what you're really saying to our audience is, as painful as it is, a two-state solution is not possible.
I'm an optimist by nature. I look at the bright side of things. I believe the best of people. But I've also, on this particular topic, been privileged. When I was working with Mr. Sharansky, one of my jobs was to connect him to Arab and Muslim and Palestinian democracy activists. Real moderates. Not people who are described as moderate like Mahmoud Abbas because he's not quite as extreme as the leaders of Hamas or Hezbollah or Iran, therefore he must be moderate, which is one of the biggest. Talk about terms used by the media or our politicians that don't fit reality. Forget about disputed versus occupied territories. Moderate is not a word that can be applied to almost any Arab or Muslim leader, but certainly not Mahmoud Abbas, even if he is less extreme in his rhetoric and or his policies or behavior than some of the murderous terrorists that are also in our neighborhood. But I have been privileged to meet with and to speak with and to be friends with people like Mohammed Dajani or Hannah Signora, Walid Salem, Rami Nasrallah, others who are Arab, Muslim, or Palestinian, or all together, who not only believe in the rightness and the justice of the Jewish people's return to our ancestral homeland and accept that, like so many Arab Israeli citizens also do, another concept, another discussion for another time, but who also are firmly committed, some of them from an Islamic standpoint, Mohammed Dajani in particular, from a theological standpoint, but the others also committed to the ideas of moderation, of tolerance, of coexistence, of openness, of an acceptance of the other, whoever that other might be, Jew, Christian, Muslim, Shia, Sunni, or what have you. I have been privileged to work with these people, these individuals. They exist. They don't have the largest of followings like Hamas or Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Iran, ISIS, or others do. I acknowledge that. But it's not a pipe dream. It's not completely only a dream or an optimism that says that this transformation is possible. Because, Mark, think about a conversation that you might have had in 1986 with a professor of politics talking about, could the Soviet Union and all of its satellites disintegrate in the course of the next 18 months? The answer would be, of course, that's preposterous. Could not possibly happen. We've seen, though, what has happened in Egypt, what happened in Iraq, what's happening today in Iran. The idea, whether it's Palestinian society or Jordanian or Egyptian or Syrian or Libyan or others, the idea that we are at the cusp, no, we're in the middle of a transformation of Arab and Muslim society is undeniable. The question is what direction it's going in. If you look at Turkey and Erdogan, that's frightening. If you look what happened in Gaza and the election of Hamas in both the territories, Judea and Samaria, what's known as the West Bank and Gaza, that Hamas won a plurality in their parliamentary elections a decade ago, it's worrisome. But in the same way that Hamas in parliamentary elections in Palestinian society was able to gain a plurality, primarily because of the anger against the corruption of Fatah and Yasser Arafat and his minions, and now Mahmoud Abbas, the opposite is also conceivable. It's not out there as in someday in the future the Messiah will come. It's very real to think that the middle class in Iran will at some point, as they did in the Green Revolution that wasn't adequately supported by the West in early 2009, it's not impossible that that same middle class society in Iran will overthrow the mullahs of Iran. It's not inconceivable.
Okay. I understand what you're saying, and I applaud your optimism. I don't share it, but then I haven't had your experiences. This is what I want. I want Nasrallah to write a piece in the New York Times, like Ron Lauder does, blasting Mahmoud Abbas. I want there to be, you mentioned Peace Now, Shalom Achshav. I want there to be a Shalom Achshav movement in the Palestinian world.
I agree.
When either of those happen, come talk to me again.
I would like you to invite on your show Mohammed Dajani, who is the head of the Wasatiyah movement, an Arab-Muslim, theologically based on Quranic sources, moderate movement towards
Can you
coexistence.
help me bring him to this?
Absolutely, I will happily make the
I
introduction.
would love it.
Now, his movement doesn't have a large following, but it will. And it should. And you can help, perhaps, to give it further exposure.
If it's possible, I would do anything. I don't want Israeli kids to die. I don't want Palestinian kids to die.
No,
but at the moment, the world I see, run by Muslims and Arabs in general, and Palestinians in particular, gives me no reason to hope outside of what you call sort of like a natural impulse towards optimism that is Jewish. And the Jew will always strive for peace. Nothing anybody ever says about how bleak the situation looks should be heard as we're giving up on peace. No, we're not.
We pray for it daily,
and
weekly, at every holiday.
But you know, the image of Jacob's ladder, reaching up into the heavens, but being firmly implanted in the ground.
Yeah.
That's the Jewish realist.
You know what David Ben-Gurion said? The only
Yes.
realist in Israel is an idealist, or the only only realist
And if
is
you-
somebody who,
right, and only if you believe
based on miracles. That's right.
Right. Yeah, very, very good.
I want to share with you one last thought. I'm doing myself a disservice by keeping us away from the discussion of
We'll
the
get
book.
to the book, I promise.
But we're on television here. So I have nothing to hide. This is a public statement, but I have actual practical, not just suggestions and recommendations, but a belief in what peace really will look like over the next 5, 10, or 15 years. And I want you to remember, you're very slightly older than I am. You may have been adult enough in 1977 when Anwar Sadat made his famous both visit to Jerusalem and speech. This was an instance of phenomenal transformation led by an individual who understood his place in Arab history and Muslim history.
And he paid for it with his life.
He did.
And if there's anyone, if there's ever a Sadat-like figure in the Palestinian world, and by the way, I don't know what you do with the fact that there really are two Palestinian worlds. There's Gaza and Hamas, and there's the West.
I'll tell you what
but if there ever is that kind of charismatic figure, then all things can change.
So I would suggest the following. Seriously, I'm being practical. King Abdullah of Jordan is perfectly aware of how fragile his regime is. We in America don't even recognize today how fragile that regime is, how the Muslim Brotherhood is basically ready to take over that society in a very extremist fashion. He is also very much aware that he comes from Bedouin stock, which is not like the majority, 70% of the citizens of Jordan who are Palestinian, who identify themselves as Palestinian. I see the possibility, for all the right reasons, because historical justice demands it, because it would protect his regime and his person, because it would bring peace to the region, because it would bring great benefit to his people there in Jordan and Palestinians around the world in terms of aid, trade, development, and what have you. King Abdullah will do a Sadat. One day, he will announce to the world the following. Number one, I, King Abdullah, recognize this historical reality that my country was originally called Palestine, that it is 70% of the territory of that mandatory Palestine, that 70% of my population self-identify as Palestinian. I am now announcing, as of today, we're changing the name of this country from Jordan to Palestine. As part of that, I welcome all descendants of the original Palestinians who are refugees living in Syria, Lebanon, elsewhere in camps, or as part of the Palestinian diaspora, living happily as citizens in Detroit or elsewhere in the United States, to affiliate with this now newly established, newly named country called Palestine. Therefore, the Palestinians have a homeland, a state, a flag, and a physical representation of their independence. What then happens with those Arab residents of Judea and Samaria and or the Arab Israelis, the Arab citizens of Israel, many of whom self-identify as Palestinians with Israeli citizenship? The world's our oyster. We can do almost anything when we get to the point of understanding that national affiliation and affiliating with a national structure that exists on a piece of land that we have historical connection to can be independent from where I live, then a Palestinian in Detroit can be proudly affiliated with the state of Palestine and root for its soccer team in the World Cup, just as a Brit expat who lives all his life in the south of France because he likes the sun roots for England's team in the World Cup, and a Jew or Arab, Muslim or Christian who lives in Hebron under the sovereignty of, who cares, Israel, Palestine, a confederative jurisdiction that would be created between them. I really believe that that is the most probable and, I would say, the most possibly successful mechanism that we can think of for resolving the Arab-Israel conflict and the desire of those who self-identify as Palestinians for their own independent state. Do I think it's going to happen? Mark my words, it's recorded on television. In the next 5 or 10 years, I cannot see Abdullah surviving as king of Jordan in any other construct. I don't wish him ill.
Well, you're making news on JBS and L'Chaim. That's fascinating. Okay, we have it on record. Within 10 years, Abdullah is going to say, I'm renaming Jordan Palestine. I want to speak to one more question that I get all the time. Ari Shavit wrote a book called My Promised Land. It had a basic basin, and the basin was the Jews stole a land from an indigenous people and in doing so destroyed that people. Did the Jews steal the land that is now the state of Israel?
No, obviously no. You know that my answer is going to be no, but I want to add to that.
I want you to explain why it's no.
There was a reason that I chose the title of my book as I did, My Israel Trail, Finding Peace in the Promised Land. There's a subtle reference there to Aryeh Shavit's book. my promised land. And one of the main arguments which is used on college campuses, in the British Parliament or elsewhere among other Palestinian supporters around the world, the argument that this land was somebody else's is simply factually incorrect. And just to reinforce the point we made earlier, you can be a supporter of Palestinian independence and a supporter of a withdrawal by Israel from the territories and still recognize these aren't narratives. There is historical objective truth to be discovered by understanding the historical reality, looking at the sources. The Ottoman Empire that controlled this area, before that, going back years, the Byzantine, before that the Romans, before that the Greeks, the Ottoman Empire that was controlling this area never established anything more than an administrative section called Southern Syria. The name given to this area by the Allies when Britain was given the mandate, calling it Palestine, was a concretization of a reference that had been used over the years, but there was never a nation state called Palestine here. The sovereign in this areas between 1917 and 1949 was the mandate given to Great Britain. And it was a mandate. What does the word mandate mean? They were given instructions. They were given temporary sovereignty over the territory from the Ottomans because of the victory of the Allies in the war. They were given instructions or a mandate to encourage the establishment of a national home for the Jews in this area. The idea that we stole the land or that we were usurpers or that we were colonialists it's an absurdity for anybody who understands the history of the region. Again, without any political, no understanding the reality of the history of the international legal framework for Israel's presence or existence does not dictate any particular policy prescription. You can be left-wing or right-wing. I can argue passionately that the Jews are the only people with the legal claim to this territory. I can also argue passionately that under international law, the Arab residents of these areas also have a legitimate claim. Politics aside, the idea that the Jews are usurpers is one of the most nefarious, one of the most violent and hostile aspects of those who would delegitimize and demonize Israel, from Mahmoud Abbas through to Edward Said and other professors in the American college campuses, through to Swedish prime ministers and, other European leaders. It's one of those strange anomalies of, I think, today's discourse that people use turns of phrase without understanding not only what the repercussions are in terms of others who are listening or reading or following, our children or our audiences or our students, misinterpretations or misunderstanding of the use of those terms. And we talked about that in terms of the American Jewish youth, but also how wrong the terminology itself is. By saying that Israel stole land from the indigenous Palestinians, we're not just doing an injustice to the Jews and our connection as a Jewish people to our ancestral homeland. We're doing an injustice to a certain extent to the Palestinians themselves in terms of wanting to encourage their claim, but doing so from a position of truth, not of falsehood. And we're certainly doing a tremendous injustice to other people who are truly indigenous people, whose rights are not being advocated for because the Palestinians are the wonder child and the poster child of the liberal and progressive world, and whose claims, therefore, not only aren't acknowledged, but aren't pushed with any of the same kind of vehemence as those who are pushing the Palestinians. It's a tragedy, I think, and there are indigenous rights activists who point to this and who are sometimes there's a friend of mine, Ryan Barros, who's an activist for the First Nations in Canada. He's one of the biggest advocates for the whole issue of the Jews as the indigenous people in our land, partially because he points to it as an example, the only example in the history of mankind of an indigenous people having regained sovereignty in their land, something the Aborigines in Australia and the First Nations in Canada and others have yet to achieve.
Aryeh, the Palestinian holds up a key. See this key, he says? This is the key to my house in Haifa. I can't use this key because the Jews took my house.
Mm-hmm.
They took my land. Is that true?
It's not true because of the lack of both contextual framing and also because of the language that's used. It is true. I believe, and I have met, and I have friendships with Arabs who were resident in Jerusalem or Haifa or elsewhere and did lose their homes. There's no question. That is true. It's a factual statement. Why they left, which is a whole now new discussion of how many left because they were told to by the Arab leadership and how many left because they were kicked out by the IDF and how many left of their own volition, it doesn't matter. Millions of people in the post-colonial period, India and Pakistan, with the creation of Pakistan and Bangladesh, millions of people died in forced marches, let alone millions more who lost their homes and had to move. More Jews lost their homes and possessions in being forced out of or leaving of their own volition the Arab countries of Morocco and Iraq and Yemen and Egypt than Palestinians, than Arabs who were either forcibly evicted or voluntarily left their homes in the course of the creation of Israel and the war, the hostile, aggressive war against Israel's founding between 1947 and 49. Of course it's factually true, but it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant because this is part and parcel of the history that we share. When I say it's irrelevant, I don't mean to be unsympathetic. It's important that we all, the West, the Arab and Muslim world, the nation-state of the Jewish people, Israel, and the Palestinian leadership take responsibility for the fact that hundreds of thousands of people, Arabs and Jews, lost possessions and property and had to move and create a new life for themselves. There should be compensation paid from a fund that the world could give to. Not that Israel owes compensation to the Arabs any more than Egypt owes compensation to the Jews who were forcibly evicted from their houses in Egypt. But we all can share responsibility, not only for the compensation paid for the disruption of our lives and forced or voluntary movements of people from one area to another, but also share the responsibility for helping people to rebuild their lives. It's one of the biggest festering sores in the Arab-Israeli conflict, that the people who self-identify today as Palestinians, the Arab refugees from 48 and from 67, have not been rehabilitated, have not been offered even the chance to be rehabilitated in terms of building a life, building permanent homes, having reasonable job opportunities in Syria, in Lebanon, in other countries where they have lived, and within the context of them being used as pawns by the wider Arab and Muslim world to continue the hostile rejection of Israel's founding in their person. It's a tragedy and something that has to be resolved.
Okay, I want to go on record. I only have a million more questions for you, but I'm putting them on hold at the moment.
Okay.
Because I do want to ask you some questions about this wonderful book, My Israel Trail, Finding Peace in the Promised Land. By the way, tell our viewers, who's Peter?
In our last segment, you asked me to describe, and I did, one of the reasons that I became interested in both the issue of living in Israel and becoming more observant, which had to do with my trip to the former Soviet Union and meeting Jewish refuseniks there, people who were given up their livelihood and were suffering greatly for their desire to immigrate to Israel and or to be more observant. What I didn't share with you then is that trip also led to my meeting my wife, who lived in England at the time, who was observant. And she and I together moved to Israel, made Aliyah. I became more observant. We were married and we built a wonderful faith-based home, had 3 children together, had 28 years of wonderful, harmonious, beautiful married life together. None of which, of course, I regret for an instant, and I don't believe that she does either. Her father was a father to me. I was closer to him, I would say, than almost any other human being. I mean, I love my father, my mother. They are my father and my mother. But my father-in-law was a father to me. A spiritual father, because he himself had become more observant in his youth, back when it was a bit less popular to be more observant as a Jew. not quite in the ambiance that we have today of all sorts of yeshivas and places for people to become more observant comfortably. And so he was also a spiritual mentor, as well as, I would say, really over the 30 years that I knew him, my closest friend. And the love that I have for him and that he had for me was something that we both celebrated. He, in fact, said to me at the point that it was clear that my divorce was imminent, he said, just because my daughter's divorcing you doesn't mean I have to. And that was Peter. And Peter passed away shortly before I finished writing the book. So when it came time to dedicate the book, I have been asked once or twice, because he's not mentioned in the book. I changed the names of our closest family members to protect their privacy. So people have asked me before, because they looked for a mention in the book. And he believed, and he said at our wedding in 1985, that he believed that it was the correct and historically inevitable thing for Jews to return home to Israel. And so that's why I said in the dedication that he loved Israel.
You write how you were motivated to do this after the pain of your divorce. But in some way, I felt you were using this as a metaphor. If I'm wrong, I want you to tell me. But you use 3 words: humility, acceptance, gratitude. That's the sort of the arc of the theme of the book. What were you trying to say?
First of all, I won't disagree with you. The trek itself is a metaphor in the sense of my desire to literally move ahead with my life. So walking the trail was physically putting into action this idea that I need to move forward somehow. My life had been turned upside down. I had to find a way. Where was I going to go now? So you're right. The themes of humility and acceptance and gratitude were some of the lessons that I learned while hiking.
You didn't have them in mind when you left.
Not at all.
They came to you organically, as it.
They did, very much so. And as I think I mentioned in the book once or twice, it's not even that they were necessarily new, these themes, to me or to the reader, but they were reinforced in me through the experiences I had on the trail, so that I was, just to take one example, I was hiking up hand over some boulders up a very, very steep mountainside, which I had not intended. I had made a mistake, and I had followed the guidance of the red guide, the authoritative guide to the trail, and I should never have followed that. We'll talk, if we want, a little bit later about forgiveness and the importance of forgiveness in my life, and specifically with regard to the instructions of the guide. But at this point, I found myself on the side of a mountain, and I was exhausted, and it was hot, and I didn't know whether I could go forward, and I sat down, and I said, I'm going to take out my phone, see if I have reception, call my son, and tell him to call out the Tesha, the search and rescue unit from the IDF, to come pick me off at the side of this mountain and get me out of here. I got nothing to prove. I wasn't looking for a challenge course, but I didn't. I basically said to myself, Aryeh, this is your reality. You're on the side of a mountain. You're not Frodo. There's no Sam with you to carry you the rest of the way. You got yourself here. Bad decisions about leaving one trail and going to another, the general decision about this crazy quest of taking this trek. You have to accept that this is where you are. This is your reality. And the truth is that I did that day and made it to my night camp, etc. I described that in the book in some detail. But as a lesson for me in my life, I ended up writing in my journal how my acceptance on the side of the mountain of my physical status, that's where I was, I had to deal with it, was directly applicable to my status in life. I never expected myself to be divorced. I was the kind of guy, even in high school and college, I dated one girl. I was a one-woman man, and I was in marriage. I believed, and I still believe, in the institution of marriage and working things out and sticking with it. Not that I have anything negative to say about anybody who gets divorced. There are marriages that are meant to break up, and if it's meant to break, then it should. I'm not saying that you stay at any cost, but I learned from my parents and from many other examples that a marriage is something that you work on, you work with. You don't just give it up because you're not happy at some point. I never envisioned myself in this reality, and yet it was that lesson from the hike itself on the side of that mountainside that helped me to come to terms with, this is your reality. You're divorced. You can't change that. you need to accept that. And in accepting it, I had a great weight lifted off me. When you ask what was that the idea of writing the book, I want to jump ahead and say, I never planned on writing this book.
But you kept a journal.
I kept a journal for myself because, first of all, I'm something of a writer. I've never written a book before, but the idea of keeping a journal was something that I learned from reading a travelogue by another writer, and I was just interested in my own kind of keeping a record of both the physical places and the contemplations and reflections that I had.
You are a wonderful writer.
Oh, well, thank you.
And I've not read the entire book. I've read excerpts, portions of the book. But whatever I read, it's so well written.
Thank you.
And it's an easy read, but it's also gripping. And there's humor and there's insight. And you should be very proud of this book. I hope everybody picks it up. What about forgiveness?
So I was going to say that I got to the end of the trail when I made the decision that, among other things I wanted to do following the trail, was to write the book.
That's when you decided to do it.
Yeah, that's when I decided to write the book, and I'll bring forgiveness into this, because the different lessons that I learned that were helping me get over my divorce, that I learned while physically hiking the trail, I felt might be of some help to others facing their own challenges, whether it's divorce or losing a job or what have you. And forgiveness, without question, was the biggest challenge that I faced. I talk about gratitude, which you mentioned. That's something that was natural within me. So the trail just reinforced that, and it helped to strengthen my sense of gratitude for my children, for my friends who helped me get through the divorce, my parents and the upbringing I had, even to my wife for the wonderful life that we had lived until that point. So gratitude was not difficult. Forgiveness, for me, was the hardest lesson that I learned on the trail. And there were, maybe it's somewhat counterintuitive. Gratitude is easy to think about how on the trail that I'm grateful for a night's sleep or food that I had or somebody who hosted me or what have you. Forgiveness is a little bit less maybe a natural, but there were a lot of things to forgive on the trail. I mean, just to start with the fact of forgiving myself for the crazy idea, what have I done? What am I doing here? Why am I doing this? It was painful, it was hot, it was lonely, it was a terrible experience. It was a wonderful experience, but there was a lot of need for me to forgive myself for making the decision. And the stupid decisions I made every other day of mistaking or going off the trail and missing a trail marker or deciding to go too far one day and not far enough or ending up walking at night. All mistakes I made that I had to forgive myself for, within the context. And then there was the writer of the trail guide I mentioned that I had to forgive again and again and again for giving absurdly mistaken instructions. And I have had conversations with him and I have told him I forgive him. It's a very important part. I don't know when this will be broadcast, but we are speaking in the week leading up to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, when the idea of forgiveness is an instrumental part of our tradition, which, and I don't need to tell you, you're the rabbi here, but which calls for practical steps of repentance, not only feeling the need, and I felt the same in terms of the forgiveness that I wanted to achieve. So speaking to him, the author of the book, Yaakov Sar, was part of that. But of course, all of this kind of circles around the main issue of the forgiveness I had to achieve to forgive my former wife for literally destroying my life as I knew it. And it came in waves, and it came over the course of a number of different experiences where I reached deeper and deeper levels of forgiveness, not just at an intellectual level. It's her right to make her decision as an adult, so of course I forgive her that, but at a deeply spiritual and emotional level of really and truly forgiving her for hurting me so terribly and for causing such a destruction in our life, in our family's life, in our social circle. It was an ongoing and weeks-long process. You could call it personal growth or self-therapy or what have you, but I think that was probably the hardest element for me to achieve, and probably the most important result of the trail itself, that then left me open to continue on with my life, open to leave the job that I was at and look for other avenues of professional fulfillment, open to be a better and more attentive father to my children, and open to love again. That forgiveness was instrumental. It built on the humility and the acceptance and the gratitude that I learned in the preceding weeks. But the forgiveness that I achieved in the 6th and the 7th week of the trek left me open to love again.
You wear a wedding ring.
I do.
What's the story?
Towards the end of the Shvil, I recognized that I really was not just open to, but I had a sense of, I wasn't sure of anything in this world, but I was confident that I would love again. And sure enough, after a period of time, I mean, it had been basically 3 years in terms of the process, but in terms of after the actual divorce, it was a good year. I found, or I should say she found me, Miriam, my wonderful, intelligent, caring and supportive and beautiful wife now of 3 years. We just celebrated our 3rd anniversary.
That's wonderful.
Thank you. We were both living in Israel. She came as a 10-year-old with her family, a bit before me. But my wedding ring, actually, on our wedding invitation, we have a quote from Rav Yehuda Nasi. It says, now I have to remember the quote, which is, of course, Uvitzeti likratcha likrati matzaticha. Rav Yehuda Levi is writing a love poem basically to God and saying that I've searched for you with all my heart. And then saying, and as I went out looking for, going towards you, I found you coming towards me. And we use that on our wedding invitation.
That's
we have it framed in our house, and that's what it says on my wedding. Uvitzeti likratech in the Hebrew. Her wedding ring says likrati matzati.
I understand. How long have you been married?
3 years.
3 years.
As of last week.
Mazal tov. That is wonderful.
Thank you.
You only deserve happiness. You're a lovely,
Thank
lovely.
you, Mark.
Aryeh, is hiking the trail something Israelis do? We talk about climbing Mount Everest, and there are certain things that people do,
Right.
because it's there and they want to do it.
Right.
Do people hike the trail?
Without question, people do. I often like to say I did it at age 51. It's something really that the 21-year-old crowd does, not the 51. But that's actually itself not really true. There are groups of senior citizens, adults, whatever you might have a day
trail?
No, exactly. We'll do a day hike, or we'll do a day or two at a time, as some of my friends do.
To the north, to the
Right.
Lebanese border.
To do it all at once is something that a certain kind of young Israeli, often secular, not necessarily religiously observant, but both, will do after their period in the army or national service. Other Israelis go to South America or to Thailand, but a growing number, an ever-growing number of Israelis hike the Israel Trail. And it's a phenomenon which is something that just warms the heart, because it's a connection to our people and our land and our history in a way, and that's why I said in our earlier conversation, it's a wonderful way to perhaps find a path for American Jewish youth who have become somewhat alienated from Israel to reconnect with our roots. Because literally, somebody said to me the other day, and I've adopted this imagery because I felt it too, that when he was hiking the trail, it was 15 years ago for him, but he was a young 23-year-old out of the army, he almost cried with every single step, because he felt that with every step, he put roots down into his land, and then the next step put roots down, and then to lift up your foot was like tearing the roots out that you had planted in the land. And that image has stayed with me since he shared it with me, and it's the kind of thing which is beautiful to see. And I met hundreds of young Israelis on the trail coming towards me or passing me more often, because I was older than they were. And we had small conversations numerous times about why are you doing this and what does it mean for you? And it's an incredibly meaningful thing. Something, for the record, that however beautiful the Pacific Crest Trail, the Appalachian Trail, or treks in Machu Picchu can be, which are beautiful, does not resonate with the same sense of meaning and history and achievement and connection that it does for any of us who walk the trail. And whether you do it for half a day because you're there as a tourist visiting Israel, or whether you do it the entire thing from length to length, I really want to encourage you and your viewers and readers of my book. That was one of the reasons that I wrote the book, by the way. I mean, the book is really two books in one. It's a book about my personal growth and experience of recovery from my divorce.
Exactly right.
But it's a book also enabling people to vicariously walk the land of Israel with me.
Absolutely right. So, I don't know if you have to close your eyes to see this or not, but I just want one or two memories of either the most beautiful moments you had on the trip or the ones that touched you the most. But give me one or two memories from that actual journey.
You didn't ask me what my favorite day or part was.
What was your favorite
No,
day?
I was going to say. I often say, when somebody does ask me that, I often say, it's like me asking you, which is your favorite child or grandchild? You asked it in a much more, I think, both delicate and focused way, because I can pick a few examples that I'll share with you. It's difficult, because every day, if you asked me to, I could give you a moving or uplifting or
Every
challenging
day?
every single day.
8
every
weeks,
single
every day.
Including the 3 weeks of traipsing through the desert, which you would
Yes.
think the monotony of 10
Yes.
hours of dull browns and yellows.
I don't know how you survived it.
There is a beauty to the desert, which I discovered on the trek, which I had never appreciated before. My wife, Miriam, lived for 20 years in Mitzpeh Yericho, and she is a lover of the desert. And she, like that,
She got it right away.
got it right away because she experiences that. But the rest of us who don't live in or have never necessarily really appreciated the beauty of the desert is astounding. And there's no question that every day I came across something that was beautiful, something that was moving, something that connected me to Jewish history and the shared history and, to a certain extent, shared destiny that we have
so
on
just
the trail.
what
An
comes to you
example.
immediately?
So immediately comes to me Tzipori, the center, the cosmopolitan center of the times of the Gemara in the Galilee was the town of Tzipori. 30,000 people. It was a metropolis for those times. Now, it's on the Israel Trail. And I slept the night before. I'm going to combine two different anecdotes because they give you two different tastes of what this was all about. The night before, I slept in the forest of Tzipori. I made my tent. I slept there, and when I woke up in the morning, I thought there was an earthquake. The ground was moving, and I didn't understand it. And then I heard some other kinds of sounds and rustling, and I opened my tent, and I found myself surrounded by literally dozens of cows. I obviously had put my tent in an area which they walk through to get from somewhere to their feeding area. And it was both frightening and incredibly fun at the same time. And I had a great conversation with the Bedouin shepherd that was shepherding these cows as to whether or not, if I was trespassing and it was wonderful because he even asked me, this is of course all in Hebrew, "Oh, are you doing the Israel Trail?" I said, "Yes." He says, "Kol hakavod." This is a Bedouin Muslim Arab shepherd who says to me, "Good for you for hiking the Israel Trail in the midst of these cows," literally, fortunately not trampling my camp, but they did trample actually one of my bags that I had left outside. That was my fault. But then I got up and I broke camp after saying my morning prayers and eating breakfast and what have you, and I walked about an hour down the trail towards Tzipori, this cosmopolitan center from Talmudic times. If I say that I was moved, that's an understatement. I walked through Tzipori, which I hadn't done in 30 years, which is a beautifully renovated or reconstructed archaeological site with incredible elements of history from Greek and Roman times back to, obviously, the Jewish community there and others more recently. But what most moved me there was I was walking through one neighborhood of this ancient Jewish community where each house had a mikveh in it. Archaeologically, you can't mistake the stairs that go down into a small, square, bath-like structure at the basement of every single house. And I thought to myself, I'm a Jew, and I'm an observant Jew. And these were Jews, and they were observant Jews. And their observance was very different than mine. We don't have mikvahs in our home any longer. But the connection that I had walking, and these are the same paving stones that they would have walked 2,500 years ago there in Tzipori, which was apparently the capital of the Jewish community there in the north of the land of Israel at the time. And I was moved to tears. I mean, I'm not ashamed. I've mentioned a few times that I cry. I cry very easily. I'm one of those guys, and I'm not embarrassed by it. I was moved to tears by by having that connection. And to a certain extent, I felt not only connected to the ancient Jews who lived there, even though their definition of what it meant to be a Jew and how to practice as a Jew was probably very different than mine. Not diametrically opposite. We share much, Shabbat, kashrut, what have you, but how they kept Shabbat, how they kept kosher was certainly different than the way I do today. But also I was looking across at the community, I think it's called Shomrei, I don't quite remember the name of this, the Jewish community across the hill. A small village, I think it's a moshav, that was established 20, 30, 40 years ago. The modern emblem of the modern return of the Jews to our ancestral homeland, making our lives here, making wine. I make wine, just by the way, and there were wine threshes there at Sipori, which I know that Shomrei has families who are making wine there too, because I had read about that. Making wine, making weddings. I couldn't stay in that community. I pitched my tent because the Israel Trail angels, which we can talk about separately if we have time, people who open their homes to hikers on the Israel Trail and provide a bed and a shower and often food and resupplies or what have you, nobody was available on the list of 3 or 4 families that were on the list of the Trail angels because they all had a wedding to go to. And those were my thoughts as I was walking around ancient Sipori, was connecting it to this community, a new modern community of Jews living across the way who were celebrating weddings and making wine, just as the ancient Jewish community did there in Sipori. And for me, it's just one example of how hiking the Israel Trail means so much to any of us who want to connect with our people and our shared history and shared destiny, because that's what it's all about. That's why it's the Israel Trail and not just the Pilgrim's Trail in Spain and Portugal or what have you.
You are fabulous. I love you
you.
so much. I know you are absolutely fabulous, and you've written a fabulous book.
Thank you.
And you've touched on some of the reasons why people should have this book in their home library and read it from cover to cover. And it may be that people, after reading this book, when they go to Israel, will make a point of being in some way on the Israel Trail. But I
would
thank
hope
you
they
so
do.
much. I thank you for your neshama and for your willingness to be so open with me. And I hope first of all, I wish you kol tuv v'hatzlacha in all you do.
Thank you.
But more than that, I hope you come back time and time again, that you sit in this chair and any other chair that I have for you, and that you have a home here always. I thank you, Aryeh, very, very much.
Thank you, Mark.
Aryeh Green, whose book describing his 600-mile hike from one end of Israel to the other is entitled My Israel Trail, Finding Peace in the Promised Land. And there's so much yet we have to discuss, so I can't wait for the next time that you're on at this table.
It'll be a pleasure.
As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to any of the ideas expressed here on this edition of L'Chaim. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook page, or tweet me. I look forward to hearing from many of you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'Chaim, my friends, to life.
L'Chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.